The photograph appeared unremarkable at first glance when it arrived at the Vermont Historical Society in a collection donated by the descendants of the Patterson family in May 2024. It showed what seemed to be a typical camping scene from the early 1900s. 5 young women in long skirts and white blouses pose in front of a woodland backdrop, smiling at the camera. Dr. Amanda Foster, the Society's curator of early 20th century photography, was cataloging the Patterson family collection when she came across the image. A handwritten note on the back read, "Lake Champlain Camping Trip, July 1905, with no other identifying information. The photograph showed the kind of outdoor recreation that was becoming increasingly popular among middle and upper-class women during the Edwardian era. The 5 young women appear to be in their late teens or early 20s, dressed in practical camping attire for the period. They wore dark wool skirts hemmed to a walking length just above the ankle, white cotton blouses with high collars, and wide-brimmed straw boater hats to protect their faces from the sun. Their boots were sturdy leather lace-ups appropriate for hiking. Everything about their appearance suggested respectable young ladies engaging in wholesome outdoor activity. Behind them stood 2 canvas tents pitched among tall pine trees. A campfire circle was visible to one side, with what appeared to be cooking equipment arranged nearby. The scene epitomized the growing camping movement that had taken root among American women in the early 1900s. By 1905, organized camping for girls and young women had been expanding rapidly for over a decade. Laura Mattoon had founded Camp Kahanka, the first private independent girls' camp, in 1902. The camping movement represented something revolutionary for women. Opportunities for adventure, physical activity, and independence that had previously been reserved primarily for men and boys. Dr. Foster was familiar with this history, having written her dissertation on women's outdoor recreation in the Progressive Era. She knew that these camping trips were often more than simple recreation. They were statements about women's capabilities, challenges to restrictive gender norms, and experiments in female independence. But as Dr. Foster examined this particular photograph more closely under magnification as part of the cataloging process, she noticed something that made her pause. In the background, visible through the open flap of the tent on the right, was a figure. At first, she thought it might be a six-camper, perhaps someone who had been inside the tent when the photograph was taken and hadn't realized they would be visible in the frame. But as she adjusted the magnification and studied the figure more carefully, details emerged that transformed the entire image from a simple camping snapshot into something far more complex and disturbing. The figure in the tent was a man. He was partially concealed by the tent's canvas, but enough was visible to make out his face and upper body. He appeared to be crouching or sitting just inside the tent opening, positioned so he wouldn't be immediately obvious in the photograph, but clearly visible to anyone who looked closely. More disturbing still was his expression. Even through the grain and fading of a 119-year-old photograph, Dr. Foster could see that he wasn't smiling. His face showed what appeared to be intense focus, almost predatory attention, directed at the 5 young women posing in front of the tents. Dr. Foster felt a chill run through her. She had examined thousands of early camping photographs during her research. Mixed-gender camping trips were not uncommon. Families camped together, and organized camps sometimes had male staff or counselors. But something about this man's positioning and expression felt wrong. Why would he be hiding partially in the tent? Why wasn't he part of the main group photograph? Who was he, and why did his presence seem deliberately concealed? She pulled up the rest of the Patterson family collection on her computer, searching for additional photographs from this camping trip or any documentation that might explain the context. The collection included dozens of family photographs spanning from the 1890s through the 1940s, along with letters, diaries, and other personal papers. She found 3 more photographs from what appeared to be the same 1905 camping trip. In one, the 5 women sat around a campfire, cooking what looked like potatoes in the flames. In another, they stood at the edge of a lake, holding fishing poles. The third showed them hiking through woods, their skirts hitched up slightly to navigate rough terrain. The man did not appear in any of these other images. The camping trip seemed to have been exclusively female, which was not unusual for this period. Women's camping groups often deliberately excluded men to create spaces where they could escape social constraints and experience greater freedom. But if this was meant to be an all-female camping trip, who was the man in the tent? Dr. Foster began searching through the family papers more systematically. The Patterson family had been prominent in Burlington, Vermont in the early 1900s. James Patterson had owned a successful dry goods business, and his wife Margaret had been active in various women's clubs and reform organizations. They had two daughters, Eleanor, born in 1883, and Catherine, born in 1885. She found a diary that had belonged to Eleanor Patterson, covering the years 1904 through 1907. The entry for July 15, 1905, described preparations for the camping trip. Catherine and I are so excited for our expedition to Lake Champlain. Eleanor had written, "We have invited Sarah Whitmore, Julia Henderson, and Margaret Clark to join us. Father has arranged for a guide to help us establish camp and ensure we know the area is safe. But then we will be entirely on our own for 5 glorious days." Mother worries, of course, but Father believes strongly that young women benefit from independence and outdoor experience. "I cannot wait to be away from the constraints of town life, to wear practical clothing, and do as we please without constant supervision." The entry confirmed what Dr. Foster had suspected. This was intended to be an unsupervised women's camping trip, progressive for 1905, but not unheard of among forward-thinking families. The mention of a guide who would help establish camp and then leave seemed straightforward. But the next entry, dated July 17th, changed everything. "Our first day at camp has been marred by an unsettling discovery," Eleanor wrote, her usually neat handwriting more hurried and less careful. "After the guide, Mr. Brennan, left us yesterday afternoon, we settled in happily, making dinner over the fire and enjoying our freedom. But this morning, Catherine found evidence that someone had been near our camp during the night. Footprints around the perimeter, disturbed belongings at the edge of our site. We told ourselves it must have been an animal, perhaps a deer or bear investigating our camp." The entry continued. "But then this afternoon, while Sarah and I were fishing at the lake, Julia saw a man watching us from the woods. When she called out, he disappeared. We are trying not to be alarmed, telling ourselves he was probably just another camper or perhaps a local resident curious about our presence. But I must confess to feeling uneasy. Father chose this location because it is remote and private, but that remoteness now feels less like freedom and more like isolation." Dr. Foster read the next several diary entries with growing concern. Eleanor described how the man appeared repeatedly over the following days, always at a distance, always watching. The young women initially tried to convince themselves his presence was coincidental, but his persistent observation became increasingly impossible to ignore or rationalize. "We decided to take a photograph today, wanted to document our adventure, and prove to ourselves that we are not intimidated," Eleanor wrote on July 19th. "We dressed in our best camping attire and posed in front of our tents. Margaret set up the camera with the timer mechanism so we could all be in the picture. We were determined to look confident and happy, to create an image of female competence and joy in the outdoors." Then came the line that made Dr. Foster's blood run cold. It was only later, when we looked at the developed plate, that we realized he had been there, hiding in the tent behind us, watching us even in that moment when we were trying to assert our autonomy and fearlessness. Seeing his face in that photograph, knowing he was so close while we smiled for the camera, was more frightening than any of his distant observations had been. We packed up the next morning and returned home, our adventure cut short by his menacing presence. Dr. Foster sat back, the photograph taking on an entirely different meaning. What appeared to be a cheerful camping scene was actually the last photograph taken before 5 young women fled their campsite, driven away by a man whose intentions remained unclear but whose presence had become unbearable. The smiles on the young women's faces in the photograph were not expressions of carefree joy. They were acts of defiance, attempts to reclaim agency and confidence even as they were being stalked and observed. And behind them, literally lurking in the shadows of their tent, was a man who had destroyed their adventure. Dr. Foster continued reading Eleanor Patterson's diary, searching for more information about what had happened during and after the camping trip. The entries from late July 1905 revealed that the young women had been deeply shaken by their experience. "We told Father about the man when we returned." Eleanor wrote on July 21st, 1905. "He was furious, both at the man's behavior and at himself for not having anticipated such danger. He immediately contacted the local sheriff and insisted on an investigation. But what could they investigate? We could not identify the man. We did not know if he had actually done anything illegal. He had watched us, frightened us, intruded on our campsite, but he had not directly threatened or approached us. The sheriff said there was little they could do without more specific information. Eleanor described how the experience had affected all 5 young women differently. Some blamed themselves for being too afraid, for abandoning their camping trip rather than standing firm. Others were angry at a society that made it impossible for women to safely access the outdoor spaces that men moved through freely. All of them struggled with the violation they felt. The way their attempted independence had been undermined by unwanted male attention. Sarah says she will never go camping again. Eleanor wrote, Julia insists we should not let one disturbed individual prevent us from enjoying nature. Margaret is pragmatic, suggesting we simply ensure male chaperones accompany us on future trips. But that feels like defeat, like admitting that women cannot exist independently in outdoor spaces. Catherine and I are torn between our desire for freedom camping represents and our newfound awareness of the dangers that freedom exposes us to. Dr. Foster found letters between Eleanor and her friends in the weeks following the camping trip. They discussed whether to share their experience publicly or keep it private. Some worried that telling others would damage the growing movement for women's outdoor recreation, potentially giving parents reasons to prohibit their daughters from camping. Others felt an obligation to warn other women about potential dangers. A letter from Sarah Whitmore to Eleanor, dated August 5, 1905, expressed this dilemma clearly. I understand your desire to speak about what happened to us, but I worry about the consequences. Already my MO that uses our experience as proof that young women should not be given such independence. If others learn of it, will they not draw the same conclusions? Will they not use our fear and discomfort as justification for further restricting women's access to outdoor activities? I fear we must choose between protecting other women by warning them and protecting the broader cause of women's freedom by remaining silent. Eleanor's response, written 2 days later, showed her grappling with this complex question. You are right that silence might protect the camping movement, but at what cost? She wrote. If we say nothing, other young women will venture into wilderness unprepared for reality that some men will see their independence as an invitation or a challenge. They deserve to know what they might face. But neither can I accept that the solution is to surrender outdoor spaces to men entirely. Surely there must be some way to acknowledge the dangers while insisting on our right to camp, hike, and explore despite them. Dr. Foster found evidence that Eleanor and her friends had eventually decided to share their story, but in limited ways. They spoke to leaders of local women's clubs, contributed anonymously to articles about women's camping safety, and advised other young women planning camping trips. The photograph itself had been kept private, shown only to family and close friends as evidence of what they had experienced. But Dr. Foster also found something else in the Patterson family papers, evidence that their experience was far from unique. Eleanor had collected newspaper clippings about other incidents involving women campers and unwanted male attention. The clippings dated from 1904 through 1915 and came from newspapers across the Northeast. A clipping from a Boston paper in 1906 described a group of women from a college camping club who had been persistently followed and observed by a man during their Vermont camping trip. Another from 1908 detailed how 2 sisters camping in the Adirondacks had been forced to abandon their site after finding a man searching through their belongings. A 1910 article from Maine reported on a young woman who had been assaulted while camping alone, an attack that had sparked debates about whether women should be permitted to camp without male supervision. Eleanor had annotated these clippings with her own observations. Beside the 1910 article, she had written, "And so the victim is blamed, her independence presented as recklessness rather than courage. The man's violence is treated as inevitable, a natural consequence of a woman placing herself in a vulnerable position. How convenient this narrative is for those who wish to restrict women's freedom." Dr. Foster realized that Eleanor Patterson had been documenting a pattern, collecting evidence of a systematic problem that most people preferred to ignore. Women's camping movement was revolutionary precisely because it challenged traditional gender roles and spatial restrictions. But this challenge provoked responses from men who saw women's outdoor independence as threatening or as an opportunity for predatory behavior. She found an essay Eleanor had written in 1912, apparently intended for publication, though Dr. Foster could find no evidence it had ever been printed. The essay was titled The Freedom to Camp and the Cost of Freedom. In it, Eleanor wrote passionately about the camping movement's importance for women. She described how outdoor recreation built physical strength, confidence, and self-reliance. She argued that camping allowed women to escape social constraints that restricted their lives in towns and cities. She celebrated the growing number of women's camping clubs and girls' camps as evidence of changing attitudes about women's capabilities. But she also insisted on honestly acknowledging the risks. "We do our cause no service by pretending that dangers do not exist," she wrote. "Men who resent women's growing independence will not suddenly accept it because we venture into the wilderness. Some will see our presence in traditionally male spaces as provocative. Others will view our relative isolation as opportunity. We must prepare women for these realities while insisting that the solution is not to surrender our rights to outdoor recreation, but to change the attitudes and behaviors of men who cannot accept our presence." She proposed practical measures: women camping in groups rather than alone, establishing communication with local authorities before camping trips, carrying whistles or other signaling devices, learning basic self-defense, and creating networks where women could share information about safe camping locations and potential dangers. But she also insisted that these practical measures should not obscure the fundamental injustice. "The problem is not that women camp," she wrote. "The problem is that some men believe they have the right to intrude upon, observe, threaten, or harm women who dare occupy spaces traditionally reserved for males. Until we address this root cause, no amount of practical preparation will fully protect women or grant us the genuine freedom that camping promises." Dr. Foster was struck by how contemporary Eleanor's analysis felt. More than a century later, women still grapple with many of the same issues: how to claim outdoor spaces safely, how to balance acknowledgement of risks with assertion of rights, how to address male behavior rather than restricting female freedom. She continued researching the 5 women from the photograph. Eleanor Patterson had married in 1910 and had 2 children. She remained active in women's clubs and progressive causes throughout her life, serving on boards of several organizations dedicated to expanding opportunities for women and girls. She died in 1962 at age 79. Catherine Patterson had also married and had become a teacher. She had been involved in establishing a girls' summer camp in Vermont in the 1920s, apparently determined to create safe outdoor experiences for young women despite her own troubling experience. Sarah Whitmore, true to her letter, had apparently never camped again, but she had channeled her experience into advocacy for women's safety, working with organizations that provided resources and support for women facing various forms of harassment and assault. Julia Henderson had continued camping throughout her life, refusing to let the 1905 incident deter her. Dr. Foster found articles about Henderson's hiking and camping adventures spanning several decades. In a 1935 interview with an outdoor recreation magazine, Henderson, then 50 years old, had reflected on her decades of camping experience. "Yes, I have encountered men who felt entitled to intrude on my outdoor activities," Henderson had said in the interview. "But I have also encountered hundreds of respectful fellow outdoor enthusiasts, beautiful landscapes, profound moments of peace and self-discovery. I refuse to let the former deny me the latter. Women belong in the wilderness as much as men do. We must claim that space and defend our right to it." Margaret Clark had taken a different path. She had become involved in the suffrage movement, making explicit connections between women's right to access outdoor spaces and their broader struggles for political and social equality. In suffrage speeches from the 1910s, she had used the camping incident as an example of how women's freedom was systematically constrained and violated. "We are told we cannot vote because we are too delicate, too emotional, too innocent of the world's harsh realities," Clark had said in a 1915 speech. Yet, when we demonstrate our capability by camping and hiking, when we show ourselves competent and strong, we are punished for that capability. Our strength becomes justification for male violence. Our competence becomes evidence of impropriety. The vote is about more than politics. It is about establishing our fundamental right to exist freely and safely in all spaces, public and private, urban and wild. Dr. Foster could find no evidence that the man in the photograph was ever identified. He remained anonymous, a disturbing presence whose actions had affected 5 young women, but left no official record or consequence. In some ways, his anonymity seemed representative of a broader pattern. Countless men whose harassment, stalking, and threats toward women went unrecorded, unnamed, unpunished. She found one more relevant document in the Patterson family papers, a letter Eleanor had written to her daughter in 1940. The daughter, then 28, had written to her mother about plans for a camping trip with friends. Eleanor's response acknowledged her own complicated history with camping. "I want you to go," Eleanor wrote to her daughter. "I want you to experience the freedom and joy that camping can provide. But I also want you to be aware, prepared, and careful. The world has changed in many ways since I was your age, but has not changed enough. Women still face dangers when we claim spaces and freedoms that some believe should belong only to men. This is unjust, infuriating, and wrong. But it is also real. So go camping, my dear daughter. Build your fires. Sleep under stars. Discover your own strength and capability. But do so with eyes open, with friends beside you, with the understanding that your freedom is precious and must be both celebrated and protected." Dr. Foster organized an exhibition at the Vermont Historical Society in October 2024, titled "Hidden Dangers: Women Camping in the Fight for Outdoor Freedom." The 1905 photograph of Eleanor Patterson and her friends served as the exhibition centerpiece, displayed alongside enlarged sections showing the man lurking in the tent behind the smiling young women. The exhibition explored the broader history of women's outdoor recreation in the early 20th century, celebrating the pioneering women who had founded camps, led hiking clubs, and challenged gender norms by claiming outdoor spaces. It featured photographs of Laura Mattoon's Camp Kahanka, established in 1902 as the first private girls' camp. Display cases contained camping equipment from the era, including the heavy wool skirts and sturdy boots women wore while hiking. But the exhibition also confronted the dangers women faced in pursuing outdoor recreation. Alongside images of happy campers and successful expeditions were newspaper clippings about harassment, assaults, and the constant debates about whether women could safely access wilderness spaces. Eleanor Patterson's collected articles and her unpublished essay were displayed, showing how women of that era had grappled with these issues. One section of the exhibition focused specifically on the photograph and the story behind it. Dr. Foster had created a detailed timeline of the camping trip, using Eleanor's diary entries to reconstruct the 5 days from initial excitement through growing unease to final flight. Visitors could read Eleanor's words describing the moment they discovered the man's face in their photograph, understanding how an image meant to celebrate their independence instead documented their vulnerability. The exhibition text explicitly addressed the complexity of the situation. This photograph raises difficult questions that remain relevant today. It read, "How do we acknowledge dangers without restricting freedom? How do we protect women without blaming them for needing protection? How do we celebrate women's courage and capability while recognizing the real obstacles they face?" Eleanor Patterson and her friends wrestled with these questions in 1905. We are still wrestling with them now. The exhibition attracted significant media attention and thousands of visitors. Several major outdoor recreation magazines ran features about the exhibition, using it as a springboard for contemporary discussions about women's experiences in outdoor spaces. Online discussions about the photograph and its story spread widely across social media, with many women sharing their own experiences of harassment while hiking, camping, or engaging in other outdoor activities. The comments were striking in their consistency across more than a century. Women described being followed on trails, being harassed at campsites, feeling unsafe in spaces they had every right to access. They wrote about the anger and frustration of having outdoor experiences compromised by unwanted male attention. They discussed the impossible choices between staying home, safe but restricted, and venturing out free but vulnerable. Many visitors brought their own family stories to the exhibition. One woman explained that her grandmother had been part of the early camping movement, founding a girls' camp in New Hampshire in the 1920s. She always told us that camp was about teaching girls they were capable of anything, the woman said. But she also taught them to camp in groups, to be aware of their surroundings, to trust their instinct about danger. She never explained why these precautions were necessary. Now I understand she was teaching them to navigate the same challenges Eleanor Patterson faced. Another visitor, a wilderness guide who led women's backpacking trips, spent a long time studying the photograph. This is why all women trips matter, she told Dr. Foster. Not because women can't camp with men, but because women deserve spaces where they can focus on the experience itself rather than managing male attention or feeling responsible for male comfort. Eleanor and her friends wanted that in 1905. We're still fighting for it. The exhibition included a section on how the camping movement had evolved in response to safety concerns. It showed how women's camping organizations had developed policies, training programs, and support networks to help women camp more safely. But it also noted that these measures, while practical, place a burden of safety on women rather than addressing male behavior. Dr. Foster had located statistics on harassment in outdoor recreation from recent surveys. The numbers were sobering. Significant percentages of women reported experiencing harassment while hiking, camping, or engaging in other outdoor activities. The exhibition displayed these statistics alongside historical examples, showing persistence of the problem across time. But the exhibition also celebrated resistance and persistence. It featured stories of women who, like Julia Henderson, had refused to surrender outdoor spaces despite harassment. It highlighted the work of Margaret Clark and others who had connected outdoor access to broader struggles for women's rights. It showed how the camping movement had persisted and grown despite obstacles, how women had continued to claim outdoor spaces generation after generation. One powerful display focused on the transformation of women's outdoor clothing from the restrictive long skirts of 1905 to more practical options that emerged in subsequent decades. Photographs showed the evolution from heavy wool skirts and high collars to the bloomers and knickers that Laura Mattoon and others had advocated for, then to the midi blouses and shorter skirts of the 1920s, and eventually to modern outdoor gear designed specifically for women. The fight for practical clothing was part of the larger fight for outdoor access, the display text explained. Women couldn't fully participate in hiking and camping while wearing clothes designed to restrict movement and maintain propriety. Bloomers, knickers, and eventually pants represented not just comfort but freedom, the physical ability to move through outdoor spaces on equal terms with men. The exhibition concluded with a section titled Unfinished Business, which explicitly connected historical struggles to contemporary issues. It asked visitors to consider what had changed in over a century and what remained stubbornly the same. It posed questions rather than providing easy answers. How we create truly safe outdoor spaces for everyone. How do we hold harassers accountable rather than restricting victims' freedom? How do we change cultural attitudes that view women's outdoor presence as provocative or inappropriate? Dr. Foster gave numerous talks during the exhibition period, discussing the photograph and its significance. She emphasized that the image documented a specific moment and incident, but represented a much broader pattern. We're used to reading historical photographs as straightforward documents of the past, she explained in one talk. But this photograph shows us something more complex. On the surface, it shows happy young women enjoying outdoor recreation. Look closer, and it shows a man intruding on their experience, literally lurking in the shadows of their campsite. Both things are true simultaneously. The women's joy and capability are real. The threat to their safety is equally real. That's the tension women have navigated in outdoor spaces for over a century. Several journalists asked Dr. Foster whether she thought the exhibition might discourage women from camping or hiking. Her response was emphatic: absolutely not. That would be the opposite of what Eleanor Patterson and her friends would have wanted. They were clear that acknowledging dangers should not mean surrendering freedom. The goal is not to frighten women away from outdoor recreation, but to equip them with realistic understanding, practical strategies, and righteous anger at the injustice of having to take such measures. And equally important, the goal is to shift responsibility where it belongs, onto the men who harass, threaten, and harm women, not onto the women who dare claim outdoor spaces. The exhibition included a resource section with information about contemporary women's outdoor organizations, safety resources, and activist groups working to make outdoor spaces more welcoming and safe for everyone. Dr. Foster wanted visitors to leave not just informed about history, but empowered to engage with ongoing struggles. Descendants of all 5 women from the photograph attended the exhibition opening. Eleanor Patterson's great-granddaughter, Susan Mitchell, was 68 years old and an avid backpacker. My great-grandmother's experience didn't stop her from supporting outdoor recreation for women, Mitchell said. She made sure my grandmother learned to camp, and my grandmother made sure my mother did, and so on. Each generation was taught to be capable and careful, to claim outdoor spaces while being realistic about potential dangers. That legacy matters to me. Julia Henderson's grandson, Marcus Washington, brought additional photographs of his grandmother's many camping trips throughout her long life. She camped into her 70s, he said proudly. She always said that refusing to let fear control her choices was a form of resistance. She wanted women to know they belonged in wild places, that they had every right to be there. The exhibition ran for 8 months, attracting over 75,000 visitors. It generated enough interest that the Vermont Historical Society created a permanent display on women's outdoor recreation history, including the photograph and selected materials from Eleanor Patterson's papers. The image has been digitized and made available online, along with Eleanor's diary entries and her unpublished essay. For Dr. Foster, the exhibition confirms something she had long believed about historical documents. They can speak to present concerns in powerful ways. This photograph from 1905 resonates so strongly today because the issues it raises remain unresolved, she reflected in the exhibition catalog. Women are still navigating the tension between claiming freedom and ensuring safety. We're still debating how to acknowledge real dangers without restricting women's access to spaces and activities. We're still trying to shift cultural attitudes about women's right to exist freely in outdoor spaces. She continued, Eleanor Patterson and her friends didn't solve these problems, but they refused to let the problem silence them or stop them. They kept camping, kept advocating, kept insisting that women belonged in wild places despite the men who tried to drive them out. That persistence, that refusal to accept restrictions on their freedom, is what we need to honor and continue. The man lurking in that tent thought he could intimidate them into leaving, and he succeeded in cutting short that particular camping trip. But he didn't stop them from camping again, from encouraging other women to camp, from fighting for safer outdoor access for future generations. In the end, his attempt to restrict their freedom failed. The photograph he accidentally appeared in doesn't document his victory. It documents their resilience. The photograph remains in the Vermont Historical Society's permanent collection, a haunting reminder of both the promise of women's outdoor recreation and persistent obstacles women face in claiming outdoor spaces. It continues to generate discussion, to challenge viewers, to raise uncomfortable questions that demand honest engagement, and it preserves the story of 5 young women who, in smiling for a camera in 1905, were asserting their right to camp, to explore, to exist freely in wild places, even as a man lurked in the shadows behind them, tried to deny them that very freedom.